Our scripture reading for today is Philippians 2, 1 through 4. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, have the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Thanks be to God. Good morning. It's great to be back and to see all of you. It's been a long time. So today we're acknowledging and celebrating Indigenous Peoples Weekend. So why am I here? I think I should probably just hold this. I'm not here to represent Indigenous peoples, and I'm not any kind of an expert. But I'm here to share a story about an unusual and transforming.
I'm going to give you this one.
Okay.
So that we can...
Thank you. To tell you about this relationship I've had with the Navajo family for almost 48 years now. You might think of it as telling you the rest of the story, because many of you have met Burke and Vivian Burbank. You've heard a bit about them, but this is the story from the beginning and how we all got started. So you see the Burbank family up there. This is the Burbank family when I first met them in 1976. I was 23 years old. I was working with an experiential learning program at East High School in Denver, and one of the modules was a live-in experience with Navajo families on the reservation. I remember driving down there in this yellow school bus to Chinle, Arizona, where we pulled into a large dirt parking lot filled with pickup trucks full of Navajo families, and the inner city kids slowly got out one by one and stood there, and the names would be called of the students and a Navajo family. The kids would walk over, hop in the truck, and off they went. At the end of all of this, pairing, the lead teacher said, "Hey, there's a family that has room for one more. Is there anybody who's interested?" I shot up my hand, and that's how it all got started. So I went to live with the Burbank family with one other student that you see here. And that little fella on the far right is Burke. Next slide. There he is. There's our artist in residence. You know, he's still cute, but that's amazing. Anyway, over the course of the week, they took me to special places near their home in Canyon de Chelly. They shared their culture and language. They showed me how to make fry bread. They introduced me to family members. They welcomed me into their lives and their family. I helped attend livestock. I helped them build a fence. I did some babysitting for the parents when they went into town to shop. And I observed their prayers and corn pollen offerings in the morning at sunrise. We also laughed a lot. Next slide. So one morning, the kids decided to take me down into Canyon de Chelly to visit their grandmother. It was a journey of about 2 miles. So they got their horses, and the little ones who couldn't have made the whole trip, they put on horseback, and off we went. And at some point along the way, Clarence, the oldest, next slide, here we are hiking to the edge, and this is Clarence. He's the eldest son. I'm guessing he was about 10 years old at the time, something like that. At some point along the way, he vanished. And I was pretty panicked, and I looked around. I didn't see him, and I asked the kids, "Where'd he go?" And they just kind of giggled, and they eventually sort of, pointed over to the edge of the cliff. Next slide. And Clarence was about 6 feet down these steps over the cliff. And after he came scrambling back over the top laughing, he said, "Oh, it's okay. You know, my dad used to climb on these when he was a kid too. We do it all the time." He said, "These were left by the ancient ones. They're all over the place." So we managed to finish the trip down into the canyon. Next slide. And this was their life growing up. They could go down to visit their grandmother whenever they wanted. They could ride their horses down through Canyon de Chelly. Next. They could play in the creeks whenever they felt like it. Next. This is one of Burke's sisters. She's now a school teacher. Next. And this is the oldest daughter, Helena. Okay, next. And this is Clarence. And Clarence used to love to sing, and he sang in the back of the pickup truck if we went someplace, and he'd be singing traditional songs. He was a very spiritual and deep young man. Okay. So this is the world they grew up in: lots of love, family, and freedom. And this is also when they learned that if they wanted something, they had to work for it. So they began to make simple jewelry that they could sell to tourists. And this simple necklace that I'm wearing this morning was made by Clarence and given to me at the end of that week as a goodbye gift and a thank you. I want to just take a quick diversion here from the family story, but just to relate to you a little bit about a historical event that's significant in the history of the Navajo and this family. It's something that's known as the Long Walk. In the mid-1860s, the U.S. government decided to remove the Navajo from their traditional lands. There were too many conflicts with others who were whites and others who were coming into their area, and that was the simple solution: just simply remove them. And because there was a great deal of resistance, the Army undertook a scorched earth campaign in January of 1864, where they burned all the homes, killed all the livestock, and destroyed all the crops in Canyon de Chelly. Over 8,000 Navajo were forced to surrender in order to get food and shelter during that cold winter. And were led on forced marches from somewhere between 250 and 400 miles to a place called Fort Sumner, where they had set up an internment camp. And this place is about 160 miles east of Albuquerque, New Mexico, if you can imagine what's out 160 miles east. About 25% died of dysentery, starvation, exposure, and were buried in unmarked graves. And about 4 years later, in June of 1868, an agreement was reached. I guess that's a good way to put it, but they were released just to walk back to whatever was left they had left behind. So I mention this part of history because one night in the Burbank's Hogan, where we were living, and a Hogan is a small multi-sided log dwelling, and they either had a sod roof or more recently they might be shingled. But we were all staying in the Burbank's Hogan. We slept on the floor. But one night, the great-grandmother and great-grandfather of Burke, who were about 93 at the time, came over, and they just sat at a table in the darkness by candlelight, and they would talk to one another softly, and then they would look over at us and look deep into our eyes, and then they'd look back, and then they left. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that their parents had survived the long walk. And what must that have been like for them to have us sharing their roof, being with their family, eating their food after that experience that was so painful for all of them. Well, the next morning, the great-grandmother showed up at their Hogan carrying an axe and a shovel, and I didn't quite know what to make of this. But Helen said, it's okay, she just wants to show you how we wash our hair. So grandmother motioned to me, I followed her off into the desert, and she showed me how you dig up a yucca plant, how you clean it off, how you chop it into small pieces, and how you mix it with warm water, and how you wash your hair with it. It was a remarkable experience. And she was so warm and so loving and so welcoming to me. It felt like a remarkable act of forgiveness and welcome. Well, so as oftentimes happens after an experience like that, we had brief contact after I left, and then we lost contact with one another. But 28 years later, my school's school class, they had developed a pen pal relationship with a Navajo elder who just happened to live down near Canyon de Chelly. So when the school decided to do a field trip down there over spring break, I signed up to be a parent chaperone, and I went along with them. And before we left, I wrote a letter to the Burbanks, and I put some pictures in there from my visit with them so many years before. You know, remember me, and I'd like to see you again. Well, I never heard anything. And so I thought, well, at least I can go back and visit the place. Well, one of the common things that people do when you go to Canyon de Chelly is you walk down the White House Ruins Trail to the White House Ruins. It's the only trail you're allowed to go down without a guide. And so I went down there, and we were looking at the ruins, and we'd been there a little while, and one of my son's classmates came over, and he said, "Hey, there's a guy over here. He thinks he knows you." So I walked on over there, and here was a guy at a table selling some artwork. And he stood up, and he looked at me, and he said, "Hey, did you come down here and live with a family a long time ago?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Did you write him a letter telling him you were coming?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "I'm Burke." So we had this huge hug. And he says, "Oh, my mom lost a letter. We've been looking for you every single day." And so, wouldn't you know, the family came down, met with the students from the class at the campground we were staying. We reconnected. And in the years following, I made multiple trips down there to introduce my kids to the family, for our kids to spend time playing together, to learn from one another, just to have fun and begin to meld our families. Next. So here's Clarence, 28-something, 30 years later. He'd become quite an artist and had become a very close and special friend of mine. Next. And here's Burke with my son. He would drive us all over the canyon. He'd say, "Oh, you got to see this." He'd take us to petroglyphs and pictographs, and he'd show us all these really interesting things. And on some of these trips, the little cousins and nephews, would show up and hop in the back of the truck, and would just have this whole circus going down the canyon. And one day, one of the young men said, "Hey, you see that spot on the cliff right up there, that little flat spot?" He says, "Well, my grandmother told me that her grandmother told her that we shot a Spanish guy in the butt with an arrow right up there." And I realized, well, history is still alive. That goes back to the late 1700s. Okay, next. And this is my daughter, Rachel. I think she had a bit of Clarence in her, sitting at the edge of the cliff, but they took us to various spots of the reservation of Canyon de Chelly to look around. Okay, next. And here's Burke with his grandmother, Louise, who was about 86 years old at the time. Burke has always been a caregiver, and he had always looked for an opportunity to go visit his grandmother, take me along. And this just happens to be the hogan where she gave birth to Burke's mom many years ago. Okay, next. And this is her side canyon that was her property, and in the side canyon there's ancient pottery just laying all over the ground because it hasn't been disturbed after all these years. It's where she kept her sheep. Bert would go down there to help feed them. And I don't know if you can really see in there, but there were a few fruit trees in there. And I remarked at how beautiful they were. And she muttered something and sort of walked away, and I asked Burke, I said, "Well, what was that? What did she just say? She said, well, we had a lot more until the soldiers cut them down. So it's still alive for them. Next. This is Burke's mom, Helen. She's a master weaver. She's done remarkable rugs. She's in some books of Navajo weaving. Okay? And then they took us into some of these side canyons near their house, away from Canyon de Chelly, places where there are ruins that aren't even on the map. Nobody goes down there. There's just sort of the backyard of the family. Next. Places they visit all the time. Okay. So, move on to 2010, and the challenges of life on the reservation continue to get more and more difficult. We all know about the level of poverty, the unemployment that they struggle with, the sense of hopelessness and helplessness that can overtake. And in November of 2010, it just got to be too much for Clarence, and he hung himself. I was called by the family, invited to come down, and for the family gathering for the 4 days prior to the funeral, and then attended the funeral, and there was a seat offered for me next to his parents at the head of the room. Next. And it was a powerful bonding experience for us all. This is the immediate Burbank family, kids, children, few cousins. And we spent a few days together acknowledging the life of Clarence. Well, in May of 2019, I stopped by Burke and Vivian's home where they live now in Whitecone, and during that time, they proudly showed me all of their artwork that they had been working on, that they were so proud of, but also shared the disappointing news that they were no longer able to sell artwork at Canyon de Chelly. This was a huge blow because it's the most productive or most profitable place to sell jewelry on the reservation, and they had a very good history of time there. So what to do? On the day I left, I said, look, load up my van with everything you got. I'll take it back to Boulder and I'll sell it for you. And of course, about a half mile down the road after I left, I stopped at the, good grief, I don't know anything about selling artwork. You know, I have no clue. How am I going to do this? It's like, all right, well, who does have a clue? Who could help me with this? So I made some calls, and not long after that, I had a meeting at my house with Bonnie Forbes, Gail McDougall, Diana Schellenberger, Allison Hand was there. And I showed them the artwork, and I said, what do you think? Would there be interest here? And they said, we've got to talk to Arts Ministry. And so it wasn't long before that, before Arts Ministry decided to take on the project, invited Burke and Vivian to become artists in residence and help sponsor art shows in October of 2019. And I've got to say that everything that we've been able to do so far with the Burbanks and everything that's happened is really due to our arts ministry, and we all owe them a great deal of thanks for that. Next. So here we are on Indigenous Peoples Sunday. Burke and Vivian presented the piece of artwork that you can see in the entrance to the church. Here we are again. And by the way, just a quick note about that beautiful shirt that Burke is wearing. This is part of the rest of the story. We went straight home from church, and they had been told, we need you back here. You got to get back soon. There's all sorts of stuff we need. You come back as soon as you can. So we got home from church, and we're packing up, and Burke says, hey, brother. He calls me brother. He said, brother, what do you think of this shirt? You like this shirt? I said, yeah, it's a sharp shirt. He took it off. He said, I want to give it to you. And he literally gave me the shirt off his back, and he headed home wearing a T-shirt. Now, even before the pandemic began in 2020, as remarkable as it may seem, suicide was the second leading cause of death for children 10 to 19 on the Navajo reservation. And it's the third leading cause of death for the age group 20 to 29, at least as of 2016. More than 75% of the households experienced some level of food insecurity. So when the pandemic began in 2020, I knew what was going to happen down there, and sure enough, there were severe food shortages. The tribal offices that provided many of the necessities of everyday life, including water, propane, they all shuttered, and many were left wondering what to do. There were some Navajo Nation distribution efforts to give out food through their chapter houses, although after people would wait in long lines, the food they often received was inedible and spoiled, and so none of it could be used. So the response to appeals I made to friends, family, many of you in the congregation, the response was staggering. You all stepped up and gave generously and asked in what ways you could help. And once the food got down there that either you ordered and had delivered, and that's a trip trying to figure out how you have things delivered to a town with no zip code. But it can be done, and we figured out how to do it. And once the food and supplies got down there, Burke and Vivian began to disperse it to their families scattered around the 27,000 square mile reservation. Now, there are many people, as I mentioned, who are a part of this. Next. But this is just an example of people bringing stuff. Bob Mathias and Louisa brought things to my porch, as many of you did. Next. And loaded up my van for one of the trips that I made down there. Next. And where I was able to take it down to Burke and Vivian, where they live in Whitecone, and drop it off. And by the way, one of the things that they do on a regular basis is take care of a couple of the grandkids. This is their daughter, Vanessa. I wouldn't be at all surprised if at some point she's on tribal council. She's really something. She's strong, she's bright, and they're very proud of her. She has 5 kids, and they take care of 2 of them virtually every day. So we've talked a lot about, what we have done for them, but I think most of us who've spent any time with the Burbank family would be able to articulate what they model for us, like a new understanding of what it means to be patient. Whether it's going from dry well to dry well, looking for one that actually is productive, or one that doesn't taste like salt, or one that doesn't take like oil and gas, or one that's dry, or waiting in line for hospital care. And resilience. Not long ago, I asked Burke if he ever gets angry about historical events like the Long Walk or neglect by the federal government, and he says, nope, I've always been taught to look ahead. You keep looking forward. Doesn't do any good to look back. Humor in the face of adversity. Vivian can laugh at any day, at any time about anything, and it's remarkable. She can talk about running a tub for her kids from the water supply that comes from a tank above their house that comes out yellow. And she'll just say, oh, I have all these little banana babies running around the bathroom. I think, how do you laugh about that? But she said, oh, last week, oh my God, the water that came out of our faucet smelled like sewage. Oh. He said, you can't make this stuff up. Like, well, she just finds ways to keep laughing. The love and kindness that they've showed to us and the love and kindness that they've showed to their families. And the dedication to family that they demonstrate by taking care of them. In fact, just the other night in the pouring rain, they got a call from Vivian's mom. She was on her way back home, and she got a flat tire. So they went zooming out in the rain, found the truck, hardly pulled off on the road at all, and Burke's out there trying to change the tire. Traffic would whiz by. Vivian would be watching out as a lookout. She'd yell at Burke. He'd jump out of the way. She said, oh, you should have seen Burke move. He was jumping out of the way of these trucks and cars, and then he'd go back. And anyway, they take care of them, their families, as well as his mom and 2 disabled brothers that still live at home. So I could go on. But in the field of experiential education, we talk about what, so what, and now what. So I've talked a lot about the what. You know, what do we know about just one family on one reservation with one indigenous group of people? And so what does that have to do with us in this country or in Colorado or in this church? And now what do we do about it? What are we called to do? Currently, we're being asked to attend some sessions around our church's proposed strategic plan. And I really encourage you to attend because you'll hear about various goals for the future, some that talk about addressing structural injustices and living into our covenants, the things that we say we believe. You'll hear things about integrating social justice ministries around climate action, gun prevention, and so forth, standing in solidarity with others who face oppression or injustice, and supporting Native American efforts to address the impact of climate change. Well, in the midst of these challenges continually facing the Burbank family, all I know to do is to ask the question, what's the right first next step? Given that their truck has reached 400,000 miles and is breaking down on a regular basis, and given the fact that their truck is the central link to making all the food and aid and distribution happen and getting where they need to go to take care of family, the answer to me was pretty crystal clear, and that is we've got to get them a new truck. So after meeting with a number of people who have been intimately involved with the Burbanks and the Burbank family, and those who are all called to action, a GoFundMe campaign has been organized. And by the way, these are people also who decided that they wanted to make a trip to literally take trips down to carry things to the Burbanks. Chris Shear Cooper was the first one who, he probably looks back and says, I wonder why I did that, but we sent him off with his car, in his car full of stuff. The shocks bottomed out as he headed off down there to meet them. And Ole and Rhonda Fodham loaded up a van and made a trip, and Peter and Catherine Oakes made a trip. And Stuart and Karen Hoover also made a trip. So these are the people that I called to help me. And so we have this GoFundMe campaign. And next. I'm afraid I can't. Okay. Just wanted to mention one thing about it. We do have this GoFundMe campaign. The title of it is Our Navajo Friends Need a New Truck. And we have a link to that. If you feel so moved, it would be something tangible that you can do to help them, and as a result, all the family members who rely on them for so many things. And if you feel so moved, it would be wonderful if you would share our GoFundMe page through Facebook or other social media, or through personal appeals to friends and family. What we're talking about here, too, is that in addition to the GoFundMe campaign, if you wanted to contribute through Realm, you're certainly welcome and able to do that as well, and those funds will come over. We haven't really even announced this yet, but to date we've already raised $5,245. Thank you so much for all those of you who have already pitched in. So the challenges ahead are enormous, but so are the opportunities, and I hope you'll feel this call to action and help in whatever way it presents itself to you. Thank you very much. Amen.